So originally I wanted to talk about prioritization or prioritization research pretty directly, as I said yesterday, but sometimes you have to reprioritize, and so now I'll be talking more about preconditions of prioritization or enablers of prioritization. Another title could be how to actually end up working on the most effective things. Of course, I won't be able to present a complete answer to this question. I'm just going to pick out some aspects that I think are particularly relevant. So what is prioritization? Cost-effectiveness research or cost-effectiveness thinking and decision-making, I think, would be essentially synonymous. And basically, what we're trying to do if we're being effective altruists, of course, is we're not just trying to be altruists, but we're trying to help as many sentient beings as possible. And so we need to be constantly on the lookout or open-minded for potential better, even more effective options. And that holds true within cause areas, of course, and also across cause areas where comparisons and prioritization are especially hard. Why is that important? I think it's important because there is good evidence that it may be the case that the effectiveness of various interventions within cause areas or causes between themselves can vary by several orders of magnitude potentially. Now, of course, that's also an open question that needs to be investigated more. But it seems like there is some good evidence that this should be the case for some very clearly ineffective interventions within causes. The basic things that we would agree on, take poverty relief examples. I don't know, the examples that are standard in effective altruist discourse, like plate pumps that have been tried and refuted time and again. But there are still organizations out there that do them, and here we would agree that some other things are likely to be orders of magnitude more effective. Some things are also, of course, outright counterproductive and not just ineffective. So that's why it's important to get prioritization right. Now, prioritization or reprioritizing, being on the lookout for even more effective causes and interventions, is of course a form of mind change or potential mind change. And the problem here is that, well, mind change is really hard, but also crucial, both crucial and hard. And that's a problem, of course. And so I think it's useful to also think about ways of potentially engineering ourselves, or rather our future selves, towards being more open-minded. So it's crucial, I think, if we go one level meta here, to try and think of potential mind engineering, future self-engineering, such that we will be able to change our minds in more flexible ways in the future. There's a bunch of things we can do here, I think. First of all, I guess it's important to ask the following questions. What sort of evidence would or could persuade me to prioritize differently, to embark on different projects, say? I think that's very crucial, because it leads us to have a clearer mind about what the evidence basis is of what we're currently doing. Maybe it also leads us to realize that actually the evidence basis is pretty shaky or weaker than maybe we would intuitively have thought. In any case, it gives us a much clearer picture and also a sort of epistemic anchor to then indeed try and actually change our minds when the evidential situation changes. It's also, I think it's much easier to avoid mind change that would be very useful if we're leaving that question vague and fuzzy. Yeah? If we're never trying to be really clear and honest with ourselves about what sorts of evidence would or should change our minds in various directions, then I think it's much easier to avoid mind change. Another equally important question to ask, I think, is if we ended up changing our minds, what would we do in practice then, very specifically? Because, I mean, if we leave that open, I mean, change can often be frightening. I'll return to that psychologically. And so I think it's important to try and sketch out alternative paths that we could take in quite some detail. That can be reassuring because maybe we'll realize, hey, first we may have thought, you know, if we make a sort of change, then yeah, that change might be very radical and pretty earth-shattering or whatever in practice, and that could also bias us against taking the change possibility seriously. Whereas if we try to think through in some more detail what we would actually do in case we ended up changing our minds, that can be reassuring, and then we have sort of a picture, yeah, of, you know, what would the next practical steps look like, and we can go through that picture and maybe realize, hey, you know, this would also be livable for me and wouldn't be the end of the world, and that, I think, makes it more likely for our future selves to be open-minded. Now, behavioral change, and of course, prior to behavioral change, admitting that we were wrong, I think is quite uncomfortable. And so even if you self-describe as a rationalist and try and make mind change, rational updating, a virtue, a social norm, even then I think some parts of our minds will still dislike admitting that we were wrong. And of course, behavioral change can be quite uncomfortable. And yeah, this is borne out, I think, by a number of psychological studies in various domains. I mean, let's take the animal cause as an example. So there are pretty impressive studies that show that when you give people some meat to eat versus in a control group some plant-based food, and then ask them certain questions about the likelihood of the animals, of some animal species being able to suffer, or about their cognitive capacities, then the answers you get will tend to be quite different. So behaviors that you just engaged in, or behaviors that you engage in on a daily basis, tend to bias your thinking quite strongly. But that's also an opportunity, of course. I mean, if we succeed in making behavioral change more comfortable, then that should also be a pretty effective debiasing tool. That should also increase the probability of our minds being open to changing in the future. Yeah, sunk cost fallacy and commitment bias are a real bitch, unfortunately. And they all affect us, especially if we've already embarked on certain projects and are working for certain organizations. It should be expected, I think, that this biases us a lot. I mean, if we're at one point in our intellectual history are very confident that project X should be very effective or is likely the most effective thing to do, we embark on it, then invest a lot, maybe organize our more private lives around that project also, and so on and so forth. You know, all of that increases the amount to which we're invested in the project, increases our sunk cost fallacy and commitment bias, and can make mind change harder. And that's, of course, a problem if we accept the premise that mind change could be extremely important because there may be other opportunities out there that we may not have thought of, or that, where we just may not have the relevant data to make the right conclusions currently, but we may have this data in the future. So if we accept that sort of picture as a premise, then of course that's a really bad thing. There's a quote I particularly like in that context: "Many are stubborn in pursuit of the path they have chosen, few in pursuit of the goal." And of course projects and organizations are a path. Does anyone have an idea where this quote comes from? It's Friedrich Nietzsche, actually. So that's his contribution to effective altruism. What's a plausible partial solution to this problem? Well, I'd recommend to maybe invest some more in path-neutral stuff. I'll return to what that could mean in practice. I think, from past observation and interaction with people in the EA movement, also from self-observation, unfortunately, I've noticed the following unfortunate epistemic dynamic. So there's a bunch of people that have chosen poverty as their preferred cause, and then end up making flow-through arguments, empirical flow-through arguments for why poverty is allegedly also very likely to be best for the far future. There's also the reverse going on, of course, people who've chosen some far future cause area as their preferred area sometimes argue that, well, isn't it likely that it's also best for the current generation? I mean, if some X-risk hits, that will also be very bad for the present generation. So arguments like these. People heavily invested in the animal cause often argue that there should be flow-through effects, say from compassion spreading, that are likely to make the animal cause a very strong contender for best far future intervention also. Then also within cause areas, of course, there's the argument that, well, maybe tackling wild animal suffering is really hard. So we've been working on factory farming all along, but maybe doing that fortunately happens to be what's best for addressing wild animal suffering. Now, whatever the specific merits of these arguments, I'm very suspicious of them, because it seems like the prior probability that they work is pretty low. I mean, if you think about what the cognitive algorithm was that led to certain poverty interventions to be selected as particularly effective. I mean, people there were really optimizing for tackling the current global poverty situation. And if you're optimizing for that, then, a priori, it's pretty unlikely that the result that you would come up with should also be the best intervention for some very different goal. That seems very unlikely a priori. And, same for these other arguments listed here. And I've noticed that with myself in the past also. So there was a time some years ago when I strongly updated towards anti-speciesism. I'm still a strong anti-speciesist, of course, and then updated towards it maybe being most important to work on the animal cause. But I had never thought about some of the far future issues, say about potential disruptive impacts of emerging technologies and a bunch of other questions. And then I thought, so we should also, in terms of project and organization building, probably invest heavily into some animal project, which I then also did, which was probably justified back then, given my epistemic situation. But oh well, I mean, if I already had taken this sort of meta update into account, trying to preserve option value, maybe trying to go for something more cause neutral, maybe I would have chosen a different path. I then also noticed in myself a pattern of rationalization that when something like, okay, now I had these updates, that other causes might be comparably important. I'm not confident about that yet, but I'm very much looking forward to more research being done on these new things that I now also consider plausible contenders for being very highly effective. And then I noticed sort of a pattern of rationalization kicking in that sort of said, but maybe what I had been doing all along, these projects, miracle, were also just, the best things to do relative to sort of this new, broader goal picture that I had. But of course, a priori, this is very unlikely to be the case. So if you happen to sort of change your mind or think that you're changing your mind without ever actually changing your behavior, then something's likely to be fishy, I'd say. So as I said, one potential recommendation here is do something more cause neutral, or at least a little more cause neutral. As I said, very narrow investments reduce option value, and that may be a huge cost to pay if we take a longer term perspective. So, as I said, like a more concrete example, if you're very convinced of the poverty cause area currently, you might decide to become some sort of poverty expert, either through research or through practice, and you'll be heavily invested in that organizationally, personally. But what if at some point, for instance, it becomes clear or would become clear to you? Maybe by that point it could no longer become clear to you because your mind is so heavily invested in that other cause. What if it would become clear to your open mind that some far future intervention, say, or some animal intervention, or some other intervention that we haven't yet thought about would be better? I mean, that could be a huge problem. I mean, if it's the case that this new thing is like 10x better, then you might be losing out on most of the value that you could have generated just by not being open-minded enough. So yeah, like a suggestion would be, maybe also go for baby steps if you find this to be difficult, which I certainly do. A sort of compromise solution could be, I don't know, maybe if you're involved with several projects or an organization, maybe you could decide, and so when the next project ends and you're trying to think about further future projects to pursue, maybe you could decide to try and go for something a bit more cause neutral, either across causes or also within causes. I think within causes that applies too. There are things that are narrower and broader within cause areas, and taking these sorts of arguments into account, I think, militates for trying to go for something a little more cause neutral, maybe with our next projects. Yeah, like good contenders are sort of more general movement growth, movement building, as opposed to very narrow direct interventions already, and of course research. A related issue when we're talking about the various interventions, cause areas that we could pursue is of course the question of how to deal with cause uncertainty and cause disagreement. Yeah, as a first point, I think it's interesting to note that they may be related. I think it's useful to think of cause uncertainty as something like disagreement within oneself. Of course, it's controversial to what extent that model is accurate, but I do certainly find it useful, at least. In terms of cause disagreement, I think a point that's worthwhile emphasizing more strongly and spreading more strongly within the movement is the fact that disagreement, or peer disagreement at least, so disagreement that comes from people who we consider similarly informed, peer disagreement is actually evidence, is actually a data point against our own views. This has been worked out by a mathematician called Robert Aumann back in the 70s already, and has been further developed by some more mathematicians, economists, and formal epistemologists. So the basic point is that if you disagree with me and I'm totally unmoved, so I'm not updating to any degree towards your position, I'm not taking it any more seriously than before, then I'm also committed to believing another thing, namely basically that you're much less informed than I am, or much more stupid than I am. But when I realize this implication, I might also realize that, hey, a priori, I would think that very unlikely. So if you had asked me, and if I was being honest, do you think you're much more informed than this other person, or much more intelligent than this other person? Maybe I would say, no, probably not. Maybe we're comparably informed on this issue and intelligent when it comes to thinking about it. But then that would lead to a contradiction. So the beliefs that you're contradicting me, I'm not updating towards your position to any degree, and we're comparably informed and intelligent, is contradictory. So this set of beliefs is contradictory, and something has to give. And yeah, most plausibly, I think the element of not shifting our views to any extent is the one that should give here. So the effect of taking peer disagreement seriously is, of course, that it brings us closer together, and I think it can help avoid some movement risks like cause ossification and isolation. Kerry has addressed this, and other people have also been worried about it. I mean, yeah, certainly there is the worry that people would be pretty ossified and yeah, pretty closed-minded when it comes to their cause selection, and would find it much more interesting to just basically talk to people who already basically agree with them on cause selection, just, you know, talking through the specifics, and that this would kind of lead to yeah, much reduced dialogue within the cause areas. And I think that could indeed be a severe movement risk. Another important element here that also brings us closer together and doesn't come from taking uncertainty or disagreement into account is strategic compromise and moral trade for win-win. I do think that's another topic that should be emphasized more strongly, and that proponents of various causes should think more about. I also think it could be very much worthwhile to try and spread this idea more generally, not just within the movement, because I mean, it may well be, you know, that ultimately, and I'll return to that, say the EA movement sorts out group rationality and group coordination, and can sort of agree, maybe some decades down the line, on some more narrow intervention that most people would then think looks like that's the most important thing to push for, and then maybe there will be opposition between sort of the EA movement and other blocs in the world pushing for other things. And if the idea of strategic compromise and moral trade was better known, then I'd be much more hopeful about the world being able to avoid conflict and being able to find win-win outcomes. So one basic idea here that's currently being developed in philosophy and economics is the idea of moral trade. And so what's being traded is moral goods, but except for, it's actually quite interesting. I mean, I often say that many EA ideas seem very obvious in hindsight, but seem to be ex ante extremely hard to discover for us, for our human minds. And moral trade is another such idea, I believe. I mean, it's really like, yeah, it's been, of course, well known for centuries, how this dynamic works in economics, how gains from trade arise. But then, you know, actually it would be pretty obvious that it's just a simple domain transfer, actually, to thinking, well, but now we're talking moral goods, and they could be traded in much the same way. Let's take a few examples here. Take the abortion debate that's still very heated in some countries. So you have pro-lifers versus pro-choicers. Some people who believe it's extremely important that abortion be illegal, and other people who believe that that the opposite is extremely important. Now, say they are roughly equally strong and they have roughly equal budget, and so they're trying to pull this rope, and one fraction is, I don't know, throwing $10 million into one direction, and the other fraction is throwing $10 million in the other direction. And then if they're doing equally effective work, they will just be neutralizing their impact. And this could also lead to an arms race, of course, and you also find that, of course, in the for-profit world, like companies hiring better and better, increasingly better lawyer teams. So you have a sort of legal power arms race going on there. And, you know, there could be the same with fundraising, increasing amounts of money being thrown in the pro-life direction and the pro-choice direction, and maybe these two parties ending up cancelling each other out in practice. So the net impact they'd have might well be zero at the end of the day. But what could they do? I mean, they could, for instance, they could try and rationally coordinate. They could say, okay, look, we realize that if we both do this, the net impact will be zero. But maybe there are other things that we don't consider like top priorities, but that we could both agree on are very good. So say both pro-lifers and pro-choicers think that supporting GiveWell charities is a very good thing to do. Maybe they wouldn't individually think that that's the most important thing to do. Maybe they think that supporting or opposing abortion legally is more important, maybe much more important. But they also realize that there is this dynamic here where they will cancel each other out, and so they could, for instance, agree to stop throwing 10 million in that direction, 10 million in that direction, and 10 million in the other, and instead throw $20 million in the GiveWell direction. And with such an arrangement, they'd then achieve a greatly net positive outcome. Another example would be nature conservationism versus wild animal altruism. Now, if the basic facts of population dynamics are indeed true that Tobias Baumann mentioned, for instance, so the basic fact that more than 99% of wild animals seem to be having lives that go roughly like birth, then struggle over the way too scarce resources against the way too numerous siblings, and then a pretty gruesome death very shortly after birth. That might lead us to take a pretty pessimistic view with regard to the welfare of wild animals. And I guess it's likely that wouldn't even depend on sort of the variant of welfarism or utilitarianism that we find most plausible. I think it's, no matter what view we take, whether more negative or more positive leaning, it's certainly on the table that the whole thing is greatly negative. Now, of course, it would be unwise to just say, okay, so let's shoot for 100% win, let's just try and reduce natural ecosystems as much as possible. One reason being that a lot of people, maybe also some wild animal altruists among them, it's by no means clear that their values are simple. They may well be complex. Someone may find wild animal altruism plausible, but also forms of nature conservationism or species conservationism plausible. And then, so that's sort of case of maybe moral uncertainty or moral multiplicity or disagreement within the same person. But let's just, for simplicity say we again have two parties, nature conservationists versus wild animal altruists. And now they could also just fight and oppose each other, or they could maybe sit down together and maybe work out compromise solutions. So instead of, one party pulling that way, the other pulling that way, neutralizing each other, or maybe even, conflicts can also lead to negative outcomes, of course. Maybe sitting down at a table and maybe finding some arrangements. So I guess Mahi was asking before what plausible interventions could be. Maybe there are. So if that's the basic picture, that we have R-selected species that bet on the numbers and have extreme numbers of offspring versus K-selectors that bet on good parental care, then one thing we could, for instance, try and do is increase the fraction of K-selected animals. Usually these are bigger animals. So maybe we could go for some interventions. Maybe you could, in that debate, of course, one would stress, hey, we're already going, as David said, for heavy interventions in nature. So what about an intervention that increased the number of large herbivores, maybe at the expense of small or very small herbivores? Smaller animals tend to have a much greater likelihood of being R-selected and betting on the numbers. Whereas the welfare of species like elephants is probably, in general, much better because they have much fewer offspring and they're able to take pretty good care of them. So maybe that would be sort of an arrangement trying to work within the limits and workings of present ecosystems, but still trying to achieve a lot of value on the wild animal altruism dimension. Another important point I think to note here is that reasons for cooperation can be especially strong when the goals are diametrically opposed. Because in that situation it's particularly likely that you're going to cancel each other out otherwise, or maybe even produce a net negative outcome. I also think it's very much worthwhile to do more research into that. So what I've been describing is I've been making a very rough qualitative argument, but I think there are good game theoretic reasons backing this up, and it's certainly very much worthwhile to study it further, just in general, cooperation among human agents, but then maybe also cooperation among artificial agents, how to implement stable cooperation between artificial agents. I think that's another very important research question. So as a basic takeaway, heuristic, I'd say it's usually unwise to try and shoot for a 100% or a 100% win along one particular value dimension that you might prefer. It's usually better to sacrifice something and have a much better shot, a much higher probability at an 80% win and maybe also helping others to realize their own 80% win as well. So to conclude, what can we achieve together? I think we really can achieve a lot. I don't know who exactly it was that said, maybe EA is the last social movement the world needs. Maybe I shouldn't be quoting that because I'm sure some journalists won't like it. But I mean, yeah, it's likely that this is quite a bit self-congratulatory and biased. But I really do believe that the EA movement is unique in several ways. I mean, I've collaborated and been part of a bunch of social movements in the past, and I do think the degree of open-mindedness and rationality that one can find, or at least potentially find in EA, is much greater, and that this could be an enormous asset. Of course, I mean, we may still be very, very much unsatisfied when looking at the status quo and realizing how much irrationality there is, probably how much miscommunication, how irrational we ourselves are. But I mean, at least I think there is the potential to do much better on this extremely crucial front than most other social movements that I know of. Of course, there are a bunch of movement risks that we need to try and prevent. But I do think that if we can solve problems of group coordination and group rationality that I touched on, and some other, of course, more external related movement risks, then I am indeed very hopeful about the EA movement. And of course, one important goal of organizing conferences like these EAX conferences is precisely to try and create dialogue and further this very goal. And with that, let me thank you so much for having been here and having contributed to achieving this goal better. Thanks so much.